Welcome. You have been told a story about a princess who saved a man, and in doing so, united two worlds. You've heard the songs. You've seen the images of a noble spirit, wild and free, finding love in the arms of an explorer. It is a beautiful myth. It is also a lie. It is a painted screen, placed over a forgotten grave to hide the rot and the screaming. We are not here to speak of the princess. We are here to speak of the child who was consumed. Her name was not Pocahontas. Her name was Matawaka, and this is the story of her unmaking. Matawaka was a child of the river, her spirit woven into the scent of damp earth and cedar. Her flaw, if you can call it that, was an unblemished curiosity, a profound belief in the world's inherent balance. She understood the cycle of the wolf and the deer, the rain and the sun. She could not comprehend an evil that devoured without hunger, an evil that saw the world not as a home, but as a thing to be broken, owned, and remade. She watched the pale, bearded men from the safety of the trees, their harsh voices a violation of the forest's silence. She saw their sickness, their desperation, but her trust in the world's balance made her vulnerable. She believed tragically that all things sought harmony. The place where the new men huddled was a scar on the land. It did not smell of life, but of industry and stagnation. The air, thick with the smoke of foreign coal, burned her nose. The dominant scent was lye soap, a sterile stench that tried to scrub the world of its own wild perfume, and beneath that, the unmistakable odor of stale beer and unwashed wool. Their structures were rigid, defying the land, and the men themselves were a walking contradiction, speaking of God while their eyes held a cold, assessing hunger. They were the sound of the axe, the scrape of metal on stone, a constant grating dissonance. The lure was not a grand gesture, but a simple, calculated lie, a promise of peace, a parley to end the starvation and the raids. Her curiosity, her naive hope for balance, was the key they turned in the lock. She was invited onto the great wooden ship, a gesture of good faith. The air below decks was suffocating, a coffined smell of bilge water, old spice, and the faint, sour tang of seasickness. Governor Dale smiled at her, a gesture that crinkled the skin around his eyes but left them as cold and flat as river stones. She sat, her skin crawling, her lungs struggling against the oppressive, dead air. The words they spoke were a meaningless low drone, like insects trapped in a jar. She smiled, nodded, performing the part of the negotiator, the ambassador of her people. She felt the moment shift before she saw it, a sudden chill in the stale air. She stood, indicating the talk was over, and moved toward the ladder to the deck. A man stepped into her path. She turned. Another blocked the other way. Then she heard it, the sound that would define the rest of her life. Not a dramatic slam, but the heavy thud of the reinforced door and the deliberate, oily click of the iron bolt sliding home. The smiles were gone. She was property. The silence that followed the click of the lock was a different kind of sound. It was the sound of a vacuum, the sound of her world ending. The damp, dark air of the brig tasted of rust and old, bitter salt. She did not scream. The shock was too profound, a cold weight that settled in her gut. This was not a negotiation. This was a trap. The polite men were gone, replaced by the reality of her captors. The scrape of boots on the deck above was the sound of her fate being decided by unseen forces, and the gentle rock of the ship was no longer a comfort, but the swaying of a cage. They did not leave her in the dark for long. The civilizing began with a terrifying false gentleness. Women were sent to her, their hands smelling of that same harsh lye soap, their movements efficient and devoid of warmth. They clucked their tongues at her skin, her body, as if she were a prized animal just purchased at market. They led her from the brig into a cabin where the air was thick with foreign perfumes that failed to mask the scent of human confinement. Their smiles were fixed, painted on, their eyes assessing her as a project, a piece of raw material to be carved. The first violation was the shears. They held her down, her youthful strength no match for their determined, practiced hands. The cold iron scraped against her scalp, a terrifying, unnatural sensation. She watched, paralyzed, as her hair, her connection to her lineage, the sacred living record of her seasons, was shorn from her head. The rhythmic snip, snip, snip was the sound of her past being methodically detached. The black strands fell to the floor, where they were swept up like so much dirt, destined for the fire, their power and meaning completely invisible to her tormentors. They burned her clothes. The deer hide, softened by her mother's hands and smoked with sacred herbs, was tossed onto a brazier. The smell of its burning was a desecration, the scent of her home turning to acrid smoke, stinging her eyes and choking her throat. They forced her, naked and humiliated, into a wooden tub. The water was not the living, flowing water of her river. It was stagnant, cold, and foul. They scrubbed her with bristled brushes and lye, their hands rough, rubbing her skin raw as if trying to physically scrape the savage from her flesh to remove the very scent of the earth she loved. Then came the prison of fabric. They called the items gifts, a linen shift, abrasive and cold against her raw skin, woolen stockings that itched and trapped the damp. And then, the true instrument of her taming, the corset. She had seen the way the English women moved, rigid and brittle, and now she understood why. It was a cage of whalebone and stiff canvas, designed to break her natural form, to reshape her into their image of delicacy. It was, she realized, a physical metaphor for their entire world. The lacing began. She tried to resist, to push them away, but she was weak from shock and the cold. Two women, one on each side, pulled the laces taut. The breath was forced from her lungs in a sharp, agonizing gasp. She could no longer fill her belly with air. She could only take shallow, panicked sips. The bones dug into her skin, forcing her spine into an unnaturally straight line. As they gave one final, brutal pull, she felt a sickening, sharp crack in her side. A rib had given way. The pain was a constant, white-hot reminder, a new axis around which her entire existence now revolved. The baptism was the final brand. They dragged her, gasping in her new cage, before the ship's chaplain. He droned in his alien tongue, his eyes rolled toward a god she did not know. He sprinkled the stinging cold water on her brow and pronounced her saved. He gave her the new name, a sound that felt like stones in her mouth, Rebecca. This, they explained through a translator, was her true name, her Christian soul. Her old life was a sin, her memories a sickness. Matawaka, they said, was the name of a dead thing. The lesson was reinforced with the precision of a torturer. When she spoke her own name, when she pleaded in the language of her people, she was met with silence and the removal of her food. Hunger became their most effective tool. Rebecca was given broth. Matawaka starved. Rebecca was spoken to with kindness. Matawaka was ignored, a ghost in her own body. She learned, through the gnawing emptiness in her stomach and the sharp pain in her cracked rib, that to survive She had to participate in her own erasure. The ship, she learned, was not returning. It was going forward. They were taking her across the great water to England. The translator explained this as a great honor, a gift for Lady Rebecca to be presented to their king. Matawaka heard the truth. She was a trophy, a piece of plunder, proof of their conquest, a living, breathing testament to their power to tame the wilderness itself. The final, irreversible severing was about to begin. The land, her mother, her people, would not just be miles away, but worlds away, beyond the reach of even the strongest spirit. The voyage was a descent into a gray, churning hell. The world was reduced to the groaning of the ship's timbers, the scream of the wind in the rigging, and the endless, heaving sickness. The ocean was not the vibrant, life-giving water she knew. It was a cold, lightless abyss, a mass of water so vast it erased all hope of return. The ship was a floating coffin, and she was trapped in its heart. The constant creak and groan of the hull, sounding like the bones of some great beast, slowly dying around her. Her body rebelled against this new false reality. The constant, unstable motion of the deck, the air thick with the smell of salt rot, stale rations, and the unwashed bodies of the sailors kept her in a state of perpetual nausea. Her mouth was forever filled with the bitter, acidic taste of bile. The sea itself seemed to be trying to purge her, to reject the unnatural thing she was being forced to become. She would spend hours clinging to the rail, not in awe of the expanse, but in a state of physical misery, her body trying to empty itself of a sickness that was now soul deep. The isolation was absolute. She was surrounded by a language that felt like a physical assault, a constant harsh drone of sharp consonants and sibilant whispers. It was a wall of noise that locked her inside her own skull. Her own words, her own songs had no purchase here. They simply died in the wind. She began to fear the silence inside her, the terrifying realization that she was starting to forget the cadence of her mother's voice, the words for son and home. Her identity was dissolving in the endless, briny air. London was not a place of wonders. It was a monument to decay. The moment she stepped onto the dock, the air attacked her. It was a physical weight, a thick, greasy soup of coal smoke, raw sewage from the Thames, the metallic tang of industry, and the overwhelming, close-pressed stench of thousands of unwashed bodies. It was the smell of a hive, of a people living on top of their own refuse, and it coated the back of her throat, a taste she could never, ever wash away. The city was a prison far larger than the ship. The buildings were monstrous, crooked things of stone and soot, leaning in over the narrow street so closely that they seemed to be trying to suffocate the sky. The sun was a pale, forgotten rumor, and the noise, it was a constant, maddening roar. The clatter of iron-bound wheels on cobblestone, the shouting of merchants, the ringing of bells, the barking of dogs. It was a cacophony that clawed at her nerves, leaving no room for a single clear thought. This, she realized, was their civilization, a world built to deafen the human spirit. They paraded her. They bound her in layers of itchy silk and stiff velvet, painting her face with white powder and red rouge, turning her into a grotesque doll, their tamed savage. She was taken to halls where people stared, their faces pale and soft. They didn't look at her with the respect of a foreign princess. They looked at her with the detached curiosity of a farmer inspecting new livestock or a child poking a strange insect. She was an object, a curiosity, a thing to be discussed but never ever heard. And then, in the suffocating press of a smoky London drawing room, she saw him, a face from before, a face from the green sunlit world that now seemed like a fever dream. John Smith? He was older, scarred, but it was him. A desperate animal sound tore from her throat, a sound that was half a plea and half a name. It was not the polite, constrained voice of Rebecca. It was the raw, broken cry of Matawaka. "See me," the cry said. "Remember me. Tell them who I am." He stopped. The din of the room faded. He turned and his eyes met hers. He saw her. He saw the silk, the powder, the desperate, caged animal peering from behind the mask. He saw Rebecca, the political trophy, the living proof of the colony's success. He saw the strangeness, the horror, the impossibility of her being here. A flicker of pity crossed his face, quickly followed by something else, discomfort, or perhaps disgust. He gave a short, formal bow, acknowledging the Lady Rebecca, not the girl he knew. He turned his back. He walked away, disappearing into the crowd of pale, whispering figures. That was it, the last door, the final, slender thread of hope that connected her to the before, had just been severed. The man who knew her true name, who had seen her in her own land, had just confirmed her death. He looked at Matawaka and chose to see only Rebecca. The psychological break was complete. The girl named Matawaka died in that room, leaving only the hollow painted shell to carry on. The sickness, which had been waiting patiently, now took hold. The English air was poison, a living, hostile thing. It was a cold, pervasive damp that seeped into her bones, a chill that no fire could touch. It clung to the heavy wool dresses, keeping her skin in a state of constant clammy misery. The air found the weakness in her lungs, the crack in her rib from the corset, and it began to nest, a rot spreading from the inside out. It began as a delicate, ladylike cough, the kind Rebecca was permitted to have, but it didn't stay that way. The cough deepened, becoming a ragged, tearing spasm that shook her whole frame. Soon it became a wet sound, a rattling in her chest, as if her very lungs were dissolving. It was the sound of her body, the last piece of her true self, desperately trying to expel the foreign, toxic world that had been forced upon it. Her nights became a landscape of terror, a blur of fever and delirium. She was trapped between the two worlds, and both were nightmares. She would see the deep, life-giving green of her father's forests, but the trees would whisper to her in the clipped, harsh cadence of English. She would try to sing the planting songs, the songs her mother had taught her, but the words that came from her mouth were the jagged, meaningless syllables of the Lord's Prayer, a prayer she had been forced to memorize. One night, in a brief moment of lucidity, she stumbled from her bed, drawn by a reflection. She stood before a polished silver mirror, a gift from her husband, John Rolfe. She stared, but she did not recognize the face that stared back. She saw a gaunt, skeletal stranger, a painted ghost. The skin was powdered a sickly, corpse-like white. The eyes were huge and hollow, burning with fever. The cheeks were two unnatural circles of red. It was a doll. It was a corpse. As she stared at this stranger, this Rebecca, the rattling in her chest built to a crescendo. A violent, racking cough seized her, bending her double. She gasped, her constricted lungs fighting for air. She spat, a desperate attempt to clear the fluid. A spray of bright, vivid crimson burst from her lips, splattering across the pristine white lace collar of her nightdress. The contrast was stark. obscene. The stranger in the mirror, this dying puppet, was coughing up the last remnants of the girl who had been. Her connection to the land, her flaw, was what was killing her. Her body, so perfectly attuned to the clean air and living water of her home, simply could not process this new world. It could not metabolize the smoke, the damp, the grief. The civilized world was not just a psychological prison, it was a literal poison. She was a wildflower transplanted into a cellar, and the rot was now complete. The civilized mask was all that was left, and it, too, was now dying. They brought doctors who spoke of consumption and weakness of the lungs. They bled her, weakening her further. They spoke to her husband of God's will, that perhaps her savage constitution was simply not strong enough for their refined world. John Rolfe sat by her bedside, his face a mask of polite concern, holding the hand of Rebecca. He whispered prayers for her Christian soul, entirely oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, that the person he was praying for was a fiction he had helped to create, and the real human being was already long gone. The room where she lay was the color of ash. A cold, gray English morning pressed against the glass of the window, offering no light, only a watery, indifferent stare. The air was a suffocating miasma of sickness, stale bed linens, and the ever-present insidious smell of damp plaster and coal dust. It was the antithesis of life, a perfectly sealed box designed to let the rot bloom. Her entire world, once as vast as the sky, had been reduced to these four walls, this bed, this suffocating air that was a pale imitation of the wind she remembered, the wind that once carried the scent of pine and river water. They gathered around her, not as mourners, but as anxious custodians. John Rolfe, her husband, his face a mask of pious public grief, clutched her frail hand. Governor Dale, other settlers, a stern-faced priest, they formed a perimeter, their dark wool suits absorbing the meager light. They were not there to comfort her passing. They were there to witness their project's completion. They were taxidermists, ensuring the prized specimen's soul was properly stuffed with their faith before the body gave out, their anxiety palpable. They needed her to die as Rebecca to validate the righteousness of their theft. The only sound in the room that was truly real was the sound of her breathing. It was a terrible, liquid sound, a thick, rattling gurgle from deep within her chest. It was the sound of her lungs, the last bastions of her native body, finally surrendering, filling with the fluid of the foreign sickness. Each breath was a struggle, a wet, tearing noise that was an obscene counterpoint to the hushed, sibilant whispers of the priest's Latin prayers. Her breath was the sound of her drowning, thousands of miles from the nearest ocean she knew. They were praying at her, not for her. Their voices were a drone, a wall of the same alien noise that had imprisoned her since she'd been locked in the ship's brig. She felt the oppressive weight of their expectations heavier than the damp wool blankets piled upon her. They saw the shell of Rebecca, the tamed savage, and they were desperate for this creation to perform its final holy act. Deep inside the ruin of her body, the ghost of Matawaka watched them, her silent scream of rage and grief unheard, her spirit cornered like an animal. The final confrontation began. The priest, his face a pale, fleshy moon, leaned in close. His breath, smelling faintly of cloves and wine, washed over her. "Pray, Rebecca," he urged, his voice a low, insistent command. He pressed the cold, hard silver of a crucifix to her cracked lips, a final attempt to brand her very soul. "Confess your faith, child. Call upon his name." This was it. the final violation. They were not content to have taken her name, her land, her body, and her life. They now demanded her last dying thought. The mask of Rebecca, the polite, hollow puppet they had built, was too weak to respond. Her lungs were too full, her body too broken. But the girl they had tried to erase, the spirit named Matawaka, was still there, trapped in the collapsing fevered dark, and she screamed. It was not a sound that could pass her lips. It was a silent, psychic explosion, a final, violent rejection of everything they were, everything they had done, a burst of pure, undiluted identity against the crushing weight of their civilized God. In that internal, silent detonation, she saw it all. She saw the flash of green, the impossible, vibrant green of her home. She smelled the wood smoke of her father's lodge. She felt the shocking, joyful cold of the river plunging over her skin. She saw her mother's hands stained with berry juice. These images, these senses, exploded behind her eyes, warring with the gray wallpaper, the stern, pale faces of her captors, the suffocating smell of the room. It was a war for her own soul, fought in the last seconds of her life. Her body was a ruin, a vessel already claimed by the consumption that had eaten her from the inside out. She was drowning, the rattling in her chest a death knell. But that internal scream, that sudden, vivid memory of who she was, ignited one last impossible spark. It was not a surge of physical strength, but a final, focused point of will. The priest was still pressing, his words a desperate, demanding hiss. Rebecca, in God's name, pray. They needed this. Their entire narrative of salvation depended on this moment. Her husband's grip tightened, his knuckles white, his own prayers a desperate command for her to submit. They needed her to die as their creation. They needed to report back to London that the savage soul had been successfully, completely replaced. They watched her mouth, waiting for the name of Jesus, for the final validating whisper from their trophy. The silence stretched, broken only by the awful, liquid sound in her throat. She gathered the last ember of her life, the last piece of her identity that they had not managed to burn, poison, or scrub away. Her lungs were full. She could not inhale. She could only expel. Her eyes, filmed with fever, locked on the priest. She opened her mouth. The sound that came out was not a prayer. It was not a word. It was a terrible, wet, choking sound, a guttural expulsion of fluid and air, and a lifetime of suppressed rage. And with that final, rattling breath, forced from a body that was already dead, she choked out a single word, a word from the before, a word from the green forest, from the living river, a word that felt like stone and earth in her throat. Matawaka. It was not a plea, it was not a prayer, it was a statement. It was her name. It was an act of pure, final remembrance. The word hung in the cold, dead air, a sound of absolute defiance. The priest flinched, pulling the crucifix back as if he had been burned. Her husband's face, a moment before composed in pious grief, slackened into raw, naked confusion. It was not Rebecca. It was not their God. It was a sound from the wilderness they thought they had tamed. And then her eyes went still. The terrible rattling in her chest stopped. The silence that fell was absolute. She had won. But it was a victory she took to her grave. Her body, the Christian vessel of Lady Rebecca Rolfe, was buried in their cold, foreign soil, a world away from the earth that knew her and waited for her return. Her last act of defiance, her only victory, was a secret she alone would keep. It was an act of remembrance heard by no one who could understand its power, an echo that immediately died in the hostile air. The men in that room, recovering from their shock, would rewrite this moment before the body was even cold. They would write letters home, testifying to her godly end, her peaceful passage into the arms of their Savior. They would conveniently forget the name she choked out, replacing it with the whispers of angels. The lie, the romanticized myth, was already being constructed over her fresh grave. Her true story was buried, not just in the earth, but beneath the crushing weight of their propaganda. And so the horror is not just that Matawaka died. The horror is that Pocahontas was born. The lie won. The romantic fable you have been told is her final, most grotesque violation. It is the victory of the machine that consumed her, and it is the sound of that machine, still grinding away long after her bones have turned to dust. You were told a story to make you comfortable. Now you know the truth. You know what was buried, and that is a secret you must now carry with you.